For more than a decade, the cloud was treated like an inevitability, a one-way door. Once you stepped through it, there was no reason and no logic to ever turn back. Companies were told the same story again and again. The cloud was cheaper, the cloud was faster, the cloud was safer, and most importantly, the cloud was the future. Startups were born in it. Enterprises migrated to it. Executives proudly announced cloud-first strategies as if they were declarations of modernity. But quietly, something changed. Not in headlines, not in keynote speeches, not in marketing decks. It changed in boardrooms, in internal cost reviews, in postmortems no one shared publicly. And today, behind the scenes, some of the biggest, most technically advanced companies in the world are doing something that would have sounded insane just a few years ago. They're moving back to on-premise systems, back to their own servers, back to infrastructure they can touch, control, and fully understand. Not loudly, not ideologically, but deliberately. To understand why, you have to rewind to how the cloud originally won. In the early days, cloud computing solved a very real problem. Owning infrastructure was painful. You had to guess future demand years in advance, buy expensive hardware upfront, maintain data centers, hire specialists just to keep the lights on. The cloud flipped that model. Instead of buying capacity, you rented it. Instead of planning for peaks, you scaled instantly. Instead of spending millions upfront, you paid monthly. For startups, this was revolutionary. You could launch a global product with a credit card. You could scale overnight. You could fail cheaply. The cloud didn't just reduce friction, it removed entire categories of risk. And for a while, the economics worked. But as companies grew, something subtle started to happen. Their cloud bills didn't just increase. They ballooned, not linearly, exponentially. Compute costs crept up. Storage costs piled on. Data transfer fees, often ignored early on, became massive. And unlike traditional infrastructure, these costs were hard to predict, harder to control, and nearly impossible to negotiate once you were deeply embedded. A company might optimize its code, improve efficiency, reduce waste, and still watch its cloud spend rise quarter after quarter. Because the cloud wasn't built for efficiency, it was built for convenience, and convenience always carries a premium. At first, that premium feels invisible. Then it feels uncomfortable. Eventually, it becomes unavoidable. But cost alone wasn't the real breaking point. Control was. As organizations matured, they began to realize that by outsourcing infrastructure, they had also outsourced leverage. They didn't control pricing. They didn't control hardware decisions. They didn't fully control performance. An outage on someone else's platform could take down your entire business, and all you could do was wait. Security incidents followed a similar pattern. Cloud providers invested heavily in security, yes, but shared responsibility models created gray zones. Who was responsible for what? Where exactly did data live? Who had access and under what conditions? For companies handling sensitive data, regulated data, or mission-critical systems, those questions stopped being theoretical. They became existential. And then there was lock-in. Once you architect your systems around a specific cloud provider, leaving isn't just expensive. It's disruptive. It's risky. It's organizationally exhausting. Entire engineering teams are built around cloud-specific tools. Processes evolve to match provider constraints. Innovation starts to happen within boundaries you didn't set. Slowly, the flexibility that once defined the cloud begins to shrink. And that's when a different question emerges. What if owning infrastructure again isn't backward? What if it's actually strategic? What if, at scale, controlling your own systems is cheaper, safer, and more resilient? This isn't nostalgia for old data centers. This isn't a rejection of the cloud entirely. It's a recalibration, a realization that the cloud is a tool, not a destiny. The shift didn't start with ideology. It started with spreadsheets. Teams began comparing long-term cloud spend against the cost of owning infrastructure outright. Not just hardware, but power, cooling, staff, maintenance, and redundancy. And for companies running predictable workloads at scale, the numbers were unsettling. What was supposed to be pay only for what you use had quietly turned into pay forever. When you own servers, costs peak early and then flatten. When you rent infrastructure, costs never stop. Some companies realized they had crossed an invisible line, the point where flexibility was no longer worth the premium. So they experimented. Not full migrations, just a workload here, a service there, internal tools, batch processing, high volume, steady state systems that didn't need elastic scaling. They brought those workloads back in-house. And something unexpected happened. Performance improved, latency dropped, costs stabilized. Engineering teams gained clarity. When you control the hardware, you know exactly where bottlenecks live. You know how data moves. You know what breaks and why. There's no abstraction layer hiding reality. For engineers, that matters. Cloud platforms optimize for the average user. On-premise systems can be optimized for you. Some teams started designing infrastructure the way they design products intentionally. They chose hardware tailored to their workloads. They optimized networks for specific traffic patterns. They removed layers of complexity that had quietly accumulated over years. This wasn't a rejection of modern technology. It was a return to understanding it. And security followed a similar arc. Owning infrastructure doesn't automatically make systems safer, but it changes accountability. When everything runs in your environment, there's no ambiguity about responsibility. No shared models. No assumptions. For industries dealing with healthcare data, financial transactions, or national regulations, that clarity was powerful. Data residency laws tightened. Compliance requirements grew sharper. Audits became more aggressive. For some organizations, the cloud wasn't just expensive, it was increasingly incompatible with their obligations. But here's the part that rarely gets talked about. This shift didn't happen all at once. Most companies didn't abandon the cloud. They hybridized. Customer-facing applications stayed in the cloud. Highly variable workloads stayed elastic. But stable, heavy, predictable systems moved home. The cloud stopped being the default and started being a choice. And that's the real change. For years, cloud adoption was framed as progress itself. To question it felt regressive. Now, the conversation is more honest. Where does the cloud actually add value? Where does it quietly drain it? That maturity is why this shift feels invisible. There are no press releases announcing, "We moved back on-prem." There are no keynotes celebrating owned infrastructure. Because this isn't about signaling innovation. It's about operational truth. The cloud isn't dying, but the myth of the cloud as a universal solution is. Technology cycles often work this way. A breakthrough solves a real problem. It gets over-adopted. Its trade-offs are ignored. Then, slowly, quietly, the industry corrects itself. That's what we're watching now. Not a reversal, a rebalance. Companies are learning that control has value. That predictability has value. That understanding your systems deeply is still a competitive advantage. And the most interesting part? The companies making this shift aren't laggards. They're often the most advanced, the ones with enough scale, talent, and confidence to question the default. The future of infrastructure won't be purely cloud. It won't be purely on-premise. It will be intentional. And the quietest revolutions are usually the ones that last. If this kind of deep, behind-the-scenes shift in technology interests you, the kind that doesn't make headlines but reshapes entire industries, then make sure you stay connected. Subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what topic you'd like broken down next, because the most important changes are rarely the loudest ones.